Alright, let's begin Standard 24. Let's see. Standard 24, the student will analyze the impact of social change movements and social change organizations of the 1960s. Here we have a lot of them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have six substandards, big area. And you see a lot of these are social change movements, like the Civil Rights Movement with SNCC, SCLC, modern women's movement or women's liberation with NOW, National Organization of Women, anti-Vietnam War movement, Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers movement, Rachel Carson's modern environmental movement, and then the conservative movement, what all these are about. So let's look at this STEM again. The student will analyze the impact of social change movements and organizations in the 1960s. This whole substandards here and all these standards have to do with these major social change movements and the organizations within them. Here they are listed here: the Civil Rights Movement, Women's Liberation Movement, Anti-Vietnam War Movement, United Farm Workers Movement, Modern Environmental Movement, Conservative Movement. All those movements are the social change movements. Now the organizations that it's talking about are really interest groups or special interest organizations or factions within this 1960s social change movement. For instance, in the Civil Rights Movement, SCLC is the Southern Christian Leadership Southern Christian Leadership Committee Conference. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I'm gonna get it right here in a minute. And then SNCC is Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. With the Women's Social Change Movement, in it is an organization called NOW, the National Organization of Women. And then the Anti-Vietnam War Movement was a group called Students for Democratic Society. We put that in there. It was SDS, Students for Democratic Society. And then with the United Farm Workers Movement, the UFW. Okay. And then with the Modern Environmental Movement was really not really an organization but a government department. It's the Environmental Protection Agency. Earth Day, there's an Audubon Society, a lot of other interest groups that formed because of this environmental movement. And then the conservative movement with Barry Goldwater. So we're going to look at all those in this unit. So let's start with A, 24A. Let's go ahead and start with compare and contrast the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, tactics. Compare and contrast their tactics. What do they do to fight for equality for African Americans? Include sit-ins, freedom rides, and changing composition. Those three tactics are what we're going to have to cover, and we'll be on the EOCT for U.S. history because there they are. Include, that's that magic word. They want us to focus on sit-ins, freedom rides, and changing composition, and then these tactics used by these two organizations we're going to have to compare and contrast. So our focus here is compare and contrast SCLC, SNCC. Probably have to identify them and then compare how they use strategies and tactics to end or bring equality for African Americans. Sit-ins and freedom rides are definitely a must. Okay, so our elements are SCLC, SNCC, sit-ins, freedom rides, and changing composition. And the theme there is social change movement, organizations, civil rights. That's what we have to look at. So we had all of these movements, but we're going to focus on one right now. That's the Civil Rights Movement and all the organizations, the tactics and all with it. Okay. So let's go to SCLC, SNCC. The SCLC, let's start with that one first, is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the headquarters of that was in Atlanta, Georgia. The leader of that was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He even discusses this in his letter from Birmingham jail that he's the leader of this, the president of it. I'll let you listen to him. He'll tell you about it.
I have the honor to of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights.
And part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conferences, one of the things it was involved in was when Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama. They went there to Montgomery, Alabama, and in the 50s and did the Montgomery bus boycott, where they refused to ride buses in Montgomery as a result of segregation on those buses. Rosa Parks was told to get in the back of the bus because a white passenger needed to sit down. She refused to leave, and they arrested her. So with this Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is the leader here is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his location was in Atlanta, Georgia. The headquarters was. And so we see here that with these boycotts, that's the form of nonviolent protest. Other types of protests were mass protests like demonstration and marches, and then all of this is a part of nonviolent civil disobedience that we talked about. He will remain nonviolent all throughout his demonstrations and marches and civil rights program. The SCLC is known for nonviolent protest. They marches in Selma, Alabama, and all over the United States who supported that march are nonviolent. And then voter drives was a big thing they did because, you know, we said before, this is before the Voting Rights Act was passed, that African Americans were being denied the ability to register to vote and to actually vote in the South. So that's one of the nonviolent things they did was voter registration drives. And here's one here, trying to get African Americans to vote and exercise the vote. And then the Montgomery bus boycott you see here in this cartoon. I'm not going your way. They're not riding the buses. Here's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Montgomery standing by a bus. All these are nonviolent forms of protest. All these are strategies and tactics used by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Alright, so all those are ways in which the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, operated in the civil rights movement. All right. The other organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. What is ironic about this committee is it begins nonviolent, but it turns violent. The irony here is it has nonviolent in its name. Changing composition is going to refer to the SNCC changing from black and whites organized in this movement to just black. They're going to kick the whites out. That's some of the changing composition. But also the changing composition talks about the SNCC turning from nonviolent civil disobedience protests like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was advocating. Then it became violent. That's a changing composition. But let's look at some of the strategies and tactics SNCC used while they were nonviolent. Let's look at those. Alright, so here they are here, and notice that there's blacks and whites mixed in this group. Students in college that devoted themselves to nonviolent forms of protest. They demand civil rights for African Americans. They challenge segregated lunch counters throughout the South in these sit-ins, and they sit there in those segregated counters until they're arrested or thrown out. So let's look at this sit-ins and freedom rides that was used by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Sit-ins began earlier than this in the 1950s, even in the 40s really. But the most popular one, the one that has a widespread reaction all over the United States, are the sit-ins that happened February the 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina at Woolworth's Company lunch counter. And the SNCC, these students, marched there, and blacks and whites were not supposed to sit at these counters. It's segregated. Jim Crow law says they could not eat together. And so what the SNCC does is organize this protest where whites and blacks together walk into these restaurants like at Woolworth's lunch counter in North Carolina, and they sit down together. and they eat. And what they experience is a lot of violence, or they've called a bunch of bad names and stuff, and some racist people come up and pour Coke on their head or ice cream and spit on them and yell at them, and that's the treatment they get when they do this sit-in. And they do not respond with violence. That's the whole point in civil disobedience. And with these news cameras going, these cameras clicking here, and the reporting of this is going to really turn the tide for civil rights, because a lot of people are going to get upset about the way these people are being treated. But this was a strategy used by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, while it was nonviolent. And here's one here showing the protest at Warth Counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, showing that they were supporting their sit-ins. And then the Freedom Rides was another strategy. The Freedom Rides actually was not February. It was actually, I think, May. Started May 4th, 1961. Washington, D.C. They left Washington, D.C. Whites and blacks both loaded on this bus here. And they rode all throughout the South, rode together in interstate buses to protest segregated buses in the South. And what's going to happen is they're going to meet a lot of violence in Alabama, where they're going to be beaten up. Here's John Lewis, who was beaten up. He's a congressman now from Atlanta in the U.S. Congress. And here's Jim Zwerg. He was a white traveler on this bus, and it shows that SNCC, while they were nonviolent using civil disobedience, were a mixed group of black and white on these buses doing these freedom rides. And they rode throughout the South. They left Washington, D.C. on May 4th, rode down through Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, down to Greensboro, North Carolina, and then to Rock Hill, South Carolina, where they had a little bit of a violence there in Rock Hill, South Carolina against them. And then they went into Atlanta May 13th to 14th. Not a whole lot, maybe a little mouth, but not much violence. Then they got into Alabama and Anniston, and in Birmingham, where a lot of the riders are going to be beaten. This is where Lewis and Zwerg were beaten, is in Anniston. And then in Birmingham, they're going to be beaten again. And then in Montgomery on May 20th, they're going to be beaten again. The bus is going to be set on fire in Anniston, like this. Then when they finally get to Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi on May 24th, they're arrested at the bus terminal there. These were the freedom rides that happened. And this was a strategy of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this one here. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, while it was nonviolent, did sit-ins like these and these freedom rides across the South like this. Alright, so that means that Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, as compared to SNCC. Okay. Now let's talk about changing composition. Now we said that the change in composition refers to, here's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that was based on Christian principles by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is initially nonviolent, and it will remain nonviolent even up till Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And then the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that nonviolent being the irony, was initially nonviolent, but it changes and it turns violent. It's going to turn into the Black Power or Black Panther movement eventually, and then this militant groups are going to take over Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So that's the change in composition that we're referring to here. What happens is a guy by the name of Stokely Carmichael asked for change and for Black Power through this Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael separated from nonviolent protest or civil disobedience used by Martin Luther King Jr. and actually turns a little bit more violent or militant. They're going to oust the whites. They're going to kick the whites out of the SNCC. And if we want to look at some of his quotes, here's a Black Power comb that African Americans would grow an afro and stick this in their hair to show, and they would raise their fist in the air and say Black Power was one of their slogans. Stokely Carmichael started this Black Power movement. And here's one of his quotes. He says, "I maintain that every civil rights bill in this country was passed for white people, not for black people." And then he says, "Now then, in order to understand white supremacy, we must dismiss the fallacious notion that white people can give anybody their freedom." So he really doesn't like white people a whole lot and doesn't think they've done enough for the black man. And then he says, as an organization which claims to be working for the needs of a community, as SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, does, must work to provide that community with a position of strength from which to make its voice heard. This is the significance of black power beyond the slogan. And then he says, it is a call for black people in this country to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community. It is a call for black people to define their own goals, to lead their own organizations. And this is why he kicked white people out. Okay. And then he said this, our grandfathers had to run. My generation's out of breath. We ain't running no more. So this shows how frustrated that African Americans were becoming, especially the younger group, to this slow progress of civil rights. And they thought that Martin Luther King Jr. was taking too long and the courts would not change fast enough. So he's going to become more aggressive in his pursuits of civil rights. And here's a picture of some African Americans holding up the Black Power sign. And in 1968, in the Olympic Games in Mexico City, two black sprinters, Tommy Smith, who's in the center here, who won the gold, and then John Carlos on the left, who won bronze, were wearing black gloves, and they raised their fist in a Black Power salute. And the International Olympic Committee suspended them from the U.S. Olympic team and banned them from the Olympic Village because of their participation in Black Power. Stokely Carmichael is going to leave SNCC and start up a group known as the Black Panther Party. And this is going to be a militant group that carried firearms, that really resorted to a lot of violence during this time period. And it's going to become very aggressive and militant and violent. And to show that SNCC turned violent after Stokely Carmichael left, his successor, H. Rap Brown, urged African Americans, he said, get you some guns, kill the honkies. And that shows how violent SNCC became. And one of the Black Power leaders was Malcolm X, and he says, yes, I am an extremist. The black race in the United States is in extremely bad shape. You show me a black man who isn't an extremist, and I'll show you one that needs psychiatric attention. And that was Malcolm X. And that shows how the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was initially nonviolent, but then turned violent with the Black Power and other militant movements. Okay, and that the SCLC was initially nonviolent and remained nonviolent. So in that we see the change in composition, the white people kicked out of SNCC, and then we see that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference stayed nonviolent. And I always tell my kids, just remember the Christian principles that was in Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That Martin Luther King Jr. said we should stay nonviolent, use civil disobedience, don't hurt others. And that's how you remember it. And the irony of nonviolent being in the name Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee when it eventually turns violent. That's a good way to remember those. And with that, I think we've met our objective. Let's see, compare and contrast the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Tactics include sit-ins, freedom rides, and change in composition. Good luck on the quiz, test, and the EOCT.